There are two ways, I think, that you can relate to the God-man. Oh, no, I want to say one more thing. Good, I don't want to skip it. Kierkegaard realizes that he's got no argument, no rational argument, no scientific argument for claiming that we are a self made out of two contradictory factors. He gets it from reading the Bible. And the whole Bible, the Old Testament, but particularly the New Testament. And he calls these books that are written in by the highest Christian person, like Sickness Unto Death, dogmatic. Dogmatic, now since the Enlightenment, dogmatic has come to mean a bad thing. You ought to be able to give good arguments for everything and not just go around and say that's how it is. When Kierkegaard says dogmatic, he means he knows it by way of the revelation that's in the Bible, and there's no other way to know it. There's no rational way to know it. You can't prove it with biology. You can't prove it by arguments like metaphysicians try to do, and so forth. You either got the revelation or you... In a certain way, you could say either you believe it or you don't, but I think in a certain way everybody believes it once they're in it, once we're in this culture. We may outgrow it. Nietzsche, you'll see, is trying very hard to help us outgrow it. He doesn't think it's a good idea to be bliss addicts. But while you're in it, anyway, it's the revelation tells you you're in it, and he doesn't claim to do anything but explain that revelation. Now I think there's only one more piece to be put into that, and that is, well, and how do you relate to Jesus? What is it to be transparently grounded in that something which established the relation? And he doesn't even want to say God. He wants to say something very, very general. But somehow or other, something or other, established the self the way it is. And Jesus seems to be the one who did it. So now how do you relate to Jesus? Well, there seem to be two ways. I've been sort of telling you one, but I think I should tell you both. I've sort of told you both. And I don't know which one Kierkegaard is for. Maybe he thinks they're both okay. I think that's what he thinks. If you're a disciple, a contemporary of Jesus, you can have an unconditional relation to Jesus. And then you've got a big risk because he might get crucified and he might even despair on the cross and give up the whole mission, and it might look like he was never a savior at all. It's a very risky business to be a contemporary of Jesus. And but if you've got faith, you can do it. And that's one possibility. I think the other one, I think that Kierkegaard is more interested in, because we're not disciples, and we can't sort of lose Jesus and be shocked by the fact that he despairs on the cross, and we betray him like Peter afterward, and all this kind of complicated things that happen. It's all over. I mean, we can't help but see it from this end where we are. So that probably is not the way we should be behaving. Well, Kierkegaard, in the second of the books where he signs them with his highest Christian name, says Jesus is the paradigm. That means he's the perfect example of something. And I've always thought, well, Jesus shows people what it is to be able to die for your friend, as he puts it. Be unconditionally committed to somebody. Oh, but maybe, and I think that's what Kierkegaard thinks. But then you get into the funny question, but boy, you read the Bible, you don't find much about Jesus going around taking on a risky unconditional commitment. What's his risky unconditional commitment? Not enough, just any old friend. I mean, it would have to be a friend like Augustine's friend, where your whole world and your identity is tied up with that friend, and that you don't hear about any such friend. Yeah. Oh, you're on my wavelength, but I want to go a little further. I used to say, well, I bet Jesus is some kind of freedom fighter, fighting for, Israeli independence from those Romans. And I used to think, of course, this is perfectly silly. There's nothing in the Bible that supports it. Now, to my amazement, there's a whole industry of Christian theologians arguing that he was, and giving arguments like, if you know the Bible, is it Peter who cuts off the ear of one of the Romans who comes to capture Jesus? Well, as they say, what is Peter, who's supposed to be a non-aggressive, I never can remember the word, a passive resistance kind of Christian? That was Jesus' way, turn the other cheek. What is this turn the other cheek person doing with a sword, carrying it around, and cutting off an ear from the Roman? And the other one that they talk a lot about is this funny thing in the Bible, those of you who know it, that Jesus keeps saying things and then saying, but don't tell anybody. And as if maybe he's giving them some kind of code about where the next meeting is going to be or something, and saying, but you can understand this, but don't go around telling people who are not on our side. I mean, maybe. It isn't as if something you have to believe, and it isn't something this course requires, but it seems to me it's a missing piece. If Jesus is a paradigm, an outstanding example, then he ought to be someone taking a risky, unconditional commitment, and maybe it's such a secret sort of underground operation that it doesn't show up very clearly in what the people are writing down, which becomes the New Testament. I think that would be very interesting. But it's clear, this is much as clear, that he became a paradigm, whether anybody knew what it was or not, that he was committed to, because Dante's way of relating to Beatrice, remember, puts Beatrice in the place of Jesus as Dante's savior, because you can have an unconditional commitment to anything, something. Remember the dog last time. I remembered, by the way, that she also wouldn't wear belts or fur or anything. I mean, this woman who had this unconditional commitment to her dog, to everything that was important to her got related to it. That's fine, because the paradigm, according to Kierkegaard, would be that there was something finite for which you had an infinite passion, and there was something, presumably, that Jesus had an infinite passion for, but we just don't know what. So either you have an infinite passion for him, or you imitate him, and he had an infinite passion for something else. That creates you as a contradictory self, and then that gives you the solution. What it is, transparently grounded in the power that established you as a set of factors. Let me tell you why I'm telling you all this. Because I told you a simpler version last time I talked about it, and I decided that was just wrong, and I had to tell you the complicated truth as I see it. I mean, I said that what you get when you get a defining commitment is it creates you as the individual you are. And that's the sense in which you are transparently grounded in everything you do in the power that posited you as an individual. But that's not really what Kierkegaard says. It's the self that got posited, the two factors. That you're transparently grounded in the power that posited it, not the power that posited you. And the it is who created the self with the contradictory factors. Now somehow you can be transparently grounded in that which established the relation, as he puts it, established itself, or been established by something else. Okay, so the self gets created by something. That's the story I just tried to tell you. It's not enough that what your defining commitment creates you as an individual. Your defining commitment is tied up with the fact that you've been created as a self with two essential factors that you can't get rid of either one, and you can't get them together by yourself. All that got established somehow, and I'm just trying to give you a story about how it got established. It's so different, by the way. I keep coming back every once in a while to Buddhism, because my son has become now a very, very religious Buddhist, and he argues with me all the time in a nice way and gives me all kinds of metaphysical arguments about how to be a good Buddhist. But one thing is sure, he's not interested in taking a risky commitment to anything. Non-attachment is absolutely crucial to his way of thinking of things, because every kind of attachment will lead to suffering. And I said, well, don't you want to be committed to your job and find it really very interesting and fulfilling and so important you can't live without it? And he said, no, of course not, because then if you lose your job, you'll suffer. And so there's a whole other picture of what it is to be a self, in which you want to get rid of the involvement side of the self in order to avoid suffering and get some other kind of bliss. I don't know what kind of bliss, a bliss that doesn't come with anguish and so forth. But it's not something... So if you ask yourself, does Kierkegaard think the Buddhists are in despair? I think the answer is no. He doesn't think they're in the bliss and despair business. They're in something else. But we, he thinks, are in despair. Yeah.
So you wouldn't argue that it's some form of lower immediacy?
The Buddhists?
Right.
He might argue that, right. From within our world, they are missing something important. Now, and I think he would say that, because we've had a revelation which shows us that there are possibilities for the self beyond what they can see. He would say that. From within the revelation, dogmatically, it has to look that way to us. It would be that they're missing something. And therefore, we would have to say they were in lower immediacy. Right. And we, I guess then, I think I see what you're up to, then rightly, we would have to say they would be in despair, or else we'd have to say, and I think that's what Dante would say, they just missed out on something. And that has the disadvantage that they don't feel bliss, but it has the advantage that they don't feel despair either. And we can see that and say that. Dante, as a good Christian, as I say, puts all the pagans, and if he knew the Buddhists, he'd put them there too, in limbo, which is neither hell nor paradise, and so forth. So anyway, you could take a view that we know they're missing something, but that doesn't mean that they can't have their own kind of fulfillment. The Greeks did, and the Buddhists do. And it would be, from our point of view, despair, because they're missing this much more superversion. And we have to say that. That's what we believe, I think. That's what I believe anyway when I argue with my son. But they will say, no, you're all wrong. You've got yourself into this huge tangle of bliss and anguish and despair. And there is another form of life and meditation which will get you some kind of full experience without all that hang-up. And there's no place where you can stand, I think, and say, well, they're just wrong. You can just be dogmatic. We're back to that again. You can say, if you live in the revelation and believe in the revelation and are formed by the revelation, they are certainly going to look wrong to you. Yeah.
And somebody from the Western culture who became a Buddhist would be in despair, though, because they were raised with all of
That's fascinating. You hear her question. I mean, would if you became a Buddhist, if you'd been raised in the West, would you be in despair? I think so. But my son certainly doesn't think so. And it's a tough one. I don't know. I guess, you know what I really think? Enough meditation and you can get out of it. I mean, after being alone for 10 days, as he's done, but without seeing another human being or saying anything and meditating all the time, who knows what it does to your neurons? You may end up so much reborn that you're out of it. I think maybe he... okay.
Wouldn't following that religion with your life be a commitment? Like, wouldn't someone have to commit to Buddhism? But the point of Buddhism...
And how? But is it a commitment to something vulnerable? Is it some commitment that you could lose in such a way as to have this devastating grief effect on your life? It could be a waste of your life because you could realize you were in lower immediacy. Yes, but you can't realize that from within it. I mean, it isn't as if... I mean, when you're in it, it looks safe enough. And if you were out of it, I mean, I guess I have to say everybody's sort of capable of being reborn as a Christian, with a Christian self, and and get a commitment and so forth. And then you would have discovered... Then you would have looked like you were in despair all along when you were a Buddhist, say. But it isn't as if the Buddhism is on its own terms vulnerable. It isn't as if it sees the sword hanging over the head of Buddhism and then goes on as if it's the surest thing of all. This vulnerability story is a part of the finite temporal story, and they got rid of the finite temporal. They're only off in the eternal infinite dimension. Okay, let me, this is all interesting. Go ahead.
Do you think you can interpret Buddhism as repressing the body part?
Well, good. She says, can you think of Buddhism as repressing the finite body part? We can, inside the revelation, dogmatically think of it. But if I ask you, but what's your argument for thinking of it that way? You look inside people's heads, or you make rational arguments. You can look at it that way, but that's only because you're inside this culture. Then you will look at it that way. You'll say, and that's what we did when we looked at the Greeks. You'll say, well, they're just denying that the one half of the self is essential, and they're saying the other half is essential. They get rid of the body, finite, temporal. That's all too risky and suffering. They identify with the eternal, infinite, possible, and that gives them a freedom from suffering and a certain kind of bliss. I don't know what their word for it is. And now the question, I'll go back to you. Were they repressing the other half of the self? Well, we think so. But they don't think so. And there's no position, again, from which to prove who's right.
Well, I've heard some Buddhists say that that's what they're doing. They're trying to repress the body.
I believe it.
Yeah, and try to reach nirvana.
That's right. They try to do something. I mean, I haven't been lectured enough yet by my son. Give me more time. But they're trying to do something to the body part, such that they will get some kind of special experience with the other part, and they think that's what it's all about. One way to put it, if you're having this discussion with any Buddhist friends, is he keeps telling me the right way to get over suffering. And I keep wanting to say to him, suffering isn't what it's all about. It's about meaning. And unconditional commitment is getting meaning in your life. And it's tied up with a great deal of possible grief and suffering and so forth. But it's worth suffering to get meaning. And he says, no, there's only one really important thing in the world, and that is you shouldn't suffer. And what do you say to that? Well, you say what view you have about that will depend on what language you've grown up in and what tradition and what sort of family and so forth. Yeah.
What about the people who choose to rebel against this repressive culture? Are they in despair once they become atheists?
She's asking about what about the people who want to break out of this whole bliss addiction and this unconditional commitment story. Well, you're getting ahead of the story. And they are atheists, and they are nihilists, and they think that there must be something that is better than meaning and better than freedom from suffering. And guess who their leader is? Nietzsche. And we will get to Nietzsche. Nietzsche wants to break out of this, but he hates Buddhism as much as he hates Christianity. He's got his own new religion, which a lot of us are in now, because we're at a kind of transition between a culture which was a religious culture and a secular kind of culture. And so your question is fine, and of course we will get there. Anything else? Yeah.
Do you think logic is culturally relative?
Logic? No, I certainly don't. It's funny. In fact, but you can't appreciate this. My son gives me these 4,000-year-old Buddhist arguments about space and time and how they're unreal and objects are empty. And it sounds exactly like Kant's Critique of Pure Reason. I mean, you can get to this, apparently, by logic and rationality. You can get to Buddhism, or you can get to what Kant calls transcendental idealism. And it looks very similar. It's amazing. I think, this is just totally crazy probably, but it's certainly striking. It looks to me like it's no accident that the philosophy, there's some really sort of innate way the mind works, and logic and rationality just come out the same, whether you're doing it in Tibet or in Königsberg, Germany, or I think, if you want my opinion, having talked to my son and learned a lot from him, we got this Buddhist thing straight out of Buddhism. Plato went away for a while. And Plato came to visit people who had something which people would talk about, the mystery religions. I don't know much about this, but I know this. Plato came back believing in the reincarnation of souls, and he didn't believe it when he left. And it's a totally basic Buddhist idea. And he came back believing in karma, though he didn't call it karma. He said that the souls, before they got re-put in a body, which was a bad thing for them, but that it had to be done, before they got re-put in a body, the past life they had determined what life they chose for their next life. You see that if you know Buddhism, that sounds very familiar. What they did and thought and so forth in one life is going to determine whether they get a better life next round or a worse life next round. Plato got that. Where did he get that all of a sudden? I think he got it from the Buddhists. And then you get all sorts of further things, which I won't go into, that Plato's got once you believe that there's this other world. And he certainly thinks that getting stuck with the body is a kind of suffering, and you should die to the body as much as possible, and so forth. So it may not be an accident that if you do philosophy, lots of the arguments that come up look like they come from the Buddhists. I don't know. Yeah.
Is your son a Buddhist, the same one who plays computer games incessantly?
Aha! Very good question. Is my son the Buddhist, the one who plays it? The answer is yes and no. He was, but he isn't anymore. It's only happened over the last year. He was addicted to computer games. He was. I just want to go into all of the family detail. His life was a certain paradigm mess. And after a year of Buddhism and meditating and doing all these things that he's doing, he's completely clean of computer games and everything else. He's a super kid. What? Maybe a year and a half. But boy, is he throwing himself into it. He studies courses. He goes off to their retreats all by himself for 10 days. He gives up wine. He gives up meat. It's not trivial. And apparently you can change. I'm amazed how much you can change a person if they find sort of the religion that's what they need. He was so. He, as long as we're putting all the family laundry out, he's the one who feels that his childhood was so miserable that unless we can change it, he was not going to do anything in the future that could make us happy. And now he's given up that attitude, and he loves to make us happy. And he sends email remembering far off things in the past where he feels he did something that hurt us, and he apologizes, and we don't even remember. Okay. That's an ad for Buddhism. I give you an ad for Christianity now and an ad for Buddhism. But I saw another hand. Well, okay, yeah. Falls in love. Well, I wish I would. I'm eagerly waiting to see. Maybe I'll bring you a report by the end of the semester. I don't think Buddhists fall in love, and at least certainly not in the romantic way we do, because there'd be suffering. But they do something together and get married and have kids, so I don't know what to make of that yet. He'll give me lectures on it when the time comes. Okay, I want to go back to what I call leftover issues. And the main leftover issue, this comes by office hours where 10, 12 people were beating up on me over mainly the hard thing to understand what God is in all this. And first thing I want to tell you is don't worry about it. And don't get all hung up about it in your papers. It's the phenomena that matters. Remember when Kierkegaard says the lad is in love with the princess and he can't have her, and it's about this that everything turns. That's the phenomena of all we've talked about: unconditional commitments, risk, resignation, faith, and so forth. But Kierkegaard is also trying to map his Regina experience onto this phenomenology of the lad and the princess, the sort of romantic love story, and it doesn't always work very well. But I'll try to tell you how I see it, and try to put it together as best I can. So there's this problem of God is there is something called the absolute, and Abraham has an absolute relation to the absolute, which tells him to sacrifice Isaac. Now, Kierkegaard doesn't say this absolute is God. Kierkegaard doesn't say anything about God in Fear and Trembling, as far as I know, except that relating to God with love, like the Silentio does, is a kind of despair and is the wrong thing to do. But there are a lot of sort of godlike something or others running around in the book. And one of them is the absolute relation to the absolute. And then you get the puzzle that people say, but how can anything trump the unconditional commitment? How could there be this absolute coming in and saying, you have to sacrifice Isaac, you have to lose Isaac, you have to go against the ethical? Where does this get the authority to say those things if the unconditional commitment is the highest authority in your life? And Beatrice is your God person. Who can come in and how could anybody come in and say to Dante, you have to sacrifice Beatrice? And certainly Beatrice isn't going to say so. Well, then you have to think about it this way, I believe. God is something like, there is some force, and I don't think it helps to call it God, but this absolute is that tells him to sacrifice Isaac, is the absolute opponent of his absolute commitment. That is, the absolute commitment comes up against something which says, you've got to be ready to give up Isaac. You've got to live in such a way that you can give up Isaac. That doesn't come from his absolute commitment. That's the only thing that his absolute commitment can't trump. God there, the absolute that's making him sacrifice Isaac, is the sword hanging over the head of the beloved. I mean, it's the absolute fact that if you get committed to something finite, you're at the mercy of the vulnerableness of it. And that's the role, as far as I can see, that this absolute relation to the absolute, forcing Abraham to face the fact that he's got to be prepared to sacrifice Isaac. That's what it better amount to. He better accept, that is Abraham, and integrate in his life the impossibility of a safe, stable, defining relation to whatever. Because there is no such thing as a safe, stable, defining relation. There's always the risk. And God is, or this absolute force, is the risk. Now, but there's more puzzling things which I want to talk about. How in the world can this absolute say that you should give up your defining relation? Not just that it could be taken away from you, but somehow there's an authority in your life that says you have to get rid of it right now. I mean, Abraham has to sacrifice Isaac right now, and Kierkegaard has to sacrifice Regina right now, that is, break his engagement. This is the anti-ethical part. I mean, that's different than the absolute coming in and saying Isaac might die is one thing. The absolute coming in and saying you have to do it. You have to break with your defining relation. What could ever tell you that? Your defining relation is the most important thing in your life. How could it or anything else tell you you have to break with your defining relation? Well, then I think it gets really murky, but in a very interesting way. You have to ask, well, what's the phenomenon? Well, it looks like there's some higher, truer calling Abraham to sacrifice Isaac, but for what? One doesn't know. And Kierkegaard is sacrificing Regina for what? And he doesn't know. And it looks like what this is about, although Kierkegaard never says so, or I think wouldn't even admit it maybe, is that it's saying you don't really have a defining commitment to Regina. There is something else that's calling you, some other destiny that you don't know yet, but it's already telling you, don't get involved with Regina. If you get married and have a wife and lots of kids, you won't be able to fulfill your calling. And something's calling Abraham, because he's trying always to complete this parallel, who is telling him, yeah, Isaac is important and being father of the faith is important, but something else you need to be true to is even more important. But certainly Abraham doesn't know what it is. But never mind Abraham. This is just a story. I think it's important that Kierkegaard doesn't know what it is. And there is some kind of phenomena like that. It's another case of doing what you can't understand. It's a special weird case of giving up what seems to be your identity in order to find out who you really are. It's something Kierkegaard can't really touch and deal with in here, but it's in the background somehow. By that I mean, Kierkegaard's going to turn out to be the greatest Christian theologian since, Luther, if he was a theologian. I mean, he's a very, very important thinker. He had a big deal mission. All existentialist stuff comes from him. And I don't think he could have done it with a bunch of kids running around and so forth. He was doing something he didn't understand. He was giving up something which he felt was his defining relation, but he was doing it in a way which, if you look at it from later, which you're not allowed to do, remember, because he wasn't living later. But if you looked at it from later, you'd see Kierkegaard was really being called by a calling which trumped what looked like his other calling. I think that's how you have to think about it. And now let's see what else. I think maybe that's what I want to say. All these other things have come up in the discussion anyway. Let me just keep looking at this. A whole other issue. 4 minutes. I'll just touch on it. Can you have a defining commitment to the ethical? That came up a lot. That's a tough one. After having been beaten on for a while about that, I have a new idea, which I will run fast by you, that there are two different kinds of ethical. There's the Greek ethical. Agamemnon can't have a defining commitment to the ethical because being king is a role, and doing the ethical thing is a job that anybody could and should do who was king. And you can't get an individual definition out of doing your job as king. But since the Greeks didn't know anything about being individuals, according to Kierkegaard, it's not a problem. Agamemnon did what he was supposed to do. He subsumed one ethical under a higher ethical and did his job as king. The issue comes with Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King is a very interesting, complicated case. When I introduced him into the discussion early on, it was as if, look at this guy, he's got an unconditional commitment. He's ready to die for justice for the black people here in the United States and now. And that's still right. That's exactly what he's doing. But what's interesting about it is, it's sort of ethical, too. And I didn't mention that. Because what Martin Luther King is doing is intelligible. He's not would look like in the anguish of doing something absolutely disgusting, but he's doing something terrific. So he's not a good example, right off, of somebody going against the ethical, although he's a good example of having an unconditional commitment to something. Yeah.
Is he the tragic hero?
No, because that's the right question. Is he a tragic hero? No, because there's something non-universal and individual about what he's doing. It's a category Kierkegaard didn't work out. I would like to give it as a paper topic, but I think it's too hard. Martin Luther King felt not that he was a king, in the sense of Agamemnon king, he was a prophet. And prophets are called as individuals to do something now to the people. And there's a lot of unintelligibility in it. Why does it have to be Martin Luther King who does it? Why does it have to be done now? Why do you have to take the risk of killing white kids from the north to help the people in Alabama? It's sort of intelligible because he wants justice, and that's intelligible. But how he's going about getting this justice has a lot of unintelligibility in it. But, and this is the last thought on it, it's still something that he is not in anguish about. Because in the last talk before he's killed, remember, he says, I've been on the mountain and I've seen the promised land. That's prophet talk. But that says, the future will show me to be right. And remember, Kierkegaard says, his night of faith, suspending the ethical, can't say that. So where is Martin Luther King? Well, he's kind of a Christian ethical. He's more unintelligible than Agamemnon and more individual than Agamemnon, but he is still intelligible to himself, and he thinks he understands his mission, and people understand him in terms of his mission. Yeah, I don't have more to say about that, except I think I owed you an attempt to explain why Martin Luther King sort of works in the course and sort of doesn't. Okay.